Russia's war in Ukraine is about far more than just territorial control. It's a life-or-death struggle for Russia's survival. If Moscow loses, the consequences could extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine, sparking enormous geopolitical shifts, triggering economic collapse, and potentially heralding the downfall of the Russian government itself. But what's driving Russia's desperation to win? And what could unfold if they lose? To understand this, we need to look beyond the battlefield and examine the deeper stakes: political survival, economic endurance, and the shifting dynamics of global power. This war was never just about Ukraine. It's about Russia proving a point, NATO drawing lines, and the rest of the world picking sides. The battlefield might be in Ukraine, but the stakes? They're global. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it wasn't merely about reclaiming lost Soviet territory. It was about sending a message, not just to Ukraine, but to NATO, the EU, and the entire world. For decades, Moscow has viewed NATO's expansion as an existential threat to its national security. Ukraine's pivot to the West wasn't just a shift in political alignment. It was seen as a direct challenge to Russia's sphere of influence. This view has its roots in Russia's long history, where the borders of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union stretched far and wide, creating a geopolitical space that Moscow has always seen as its natural sphere of influence. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 left Russia weakened, humiliated, and paranoid about its borders. The idea of NATO creeping closer to Russia's doorstep was a terrifying one. The military alliance, founded in 1949 to counter the Soviet threat, has expanded significantly since the Cold War ended. The inclusion of former Warsaw Pact countries and Soviet republics, Poland, Hungary, and the Baltics, was seen by the Kremlin as a betrayal, a breach of promises allegedly made during the end of the Cold War. For Putin, this NATO expansion has never been a theoretical concern. It's been a very real threat to Russia's strategic and military security. The idea of NATO encircling Russia is one that has fueled his rhetoric and actions for years. So when Ukraine began moving closer to Western institutions, particularly NATO, Moscow saw the writing on the wall. If Ukraine were to successfully integrate into NATO and the European Union, Russia would be left in a vulnerable position, sandwiched between the West and its former imperial territories. The Kremlin could not allow this to happen without sending a clear message to the world and to the countries in its neighborhood about who still holds the power. But Ukraine's pivot to the West wasn't merely a political shift. It was the beginning of a broader ideological and geopolitical encirclement. For Moscow, Ukraine was the linchpin. If Ukraine, with its vast history, culture, and strategic importance, were to slip away from Russia's orbit, it would open the floodgates. What would stop other former Soviet republics, such as Georgia, Moldova, and Armenia, from seeking similar Western alignments? What would prevent Kazakhstan, an energy-rich and strategically important country, from pursuing closer ties with NATO? And more alarmingly, what would prevent Russia's own population, especially in its western regions, from questioning the legitimacy of Putin's control? A world where former Soviet republics, once part of Russia's imperial domain, align themselves with the West is an existential crisis for the Kremlin. Not only does it represent the loss of political and military influence, but it also signals the collapse of Russia's role as a global power. If Moscow could not even maintain control over Ukraine, what hope would it have of keeping the rest of its former empire intact, both politically and culturally? The fear of a crumbling empire has been one of Putin's driving forces for launching the invasion. To let go of Ukraine was to let go of the very foundation of Russia's identity and its self-perception as a global power. From the Kremlin's perspective, this war is not just about the fate of Ukraine, it's a battle for Russia's place in the global order. And nearly 2 years into the conflict, that vision is slipping away. The Russian military is bogged down in a brutal and costly war, unable to achieve its original objectives. Instead of asserting dominance, Russia is struggling to maintain its position as a world power. War is expensive, like ridiculously expensive, and for Russia, the costs are piling up fast. Manpower, weapons, sanctions, it's all bleeding the country dry. When Russian troops first crossed into Ukraine, the prevailing expectation was that the war would be short and victorious. However, what followed has been a protracted and grueling conflict that has turned into a brutal war of attrition. For Russia, the human and economic costs have been staggering. By late 2024, estimates suggest that more than 300,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the fighting. Recruitment efforts have been slow, morale has been crushed, and desertions are on the rise. But it's not just the toll on the battlefield that's hurting Russia. It's the mounting strain on the nation's economy. A 2024 report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies indicated that Russia's military spending has skyrocketed while Western sanctions continue to throttle its economy. The war machine is running, but it is doing so at an unsustainable cost. The Russian government is also facing a severe labor shortage, as hundreds of thousands of skilled professionals have fled the country. Young people, highly educated workers, and tech professionals have sought refuge in countries with more favorable economic conditions, including Western nations and neutral states like Turkey and Kazakhstan. This brain drain has resulted in long-term damage to critical sectors of the Russian economy, such as technology, finance, and energy. Furthermore, Russia's military was never built to sustain a prolonged conflict. Unlike the Soviet Union, which had a vast industrial base to support extended wars, modern Russia relies heavily on imports for many high-tech components. Sanctions have severed Russia's access to crucial technologies, leaving the military reliant on outdated equipment and black market deals to keep fighting. This has resulted in a slow, grinding war effort that is slowly draining Russia's resources. At first, Russia's economy seemed to be holding up despite the war. But now, sanctions are biting, war spending is out of control, and even some of Russia's closest partners are starting to back away. For now, Russia's economy hasn't collapsed entirely, but the cracks are widening, and the warning signs are everywhere. Inflation is rising, the ruble is unstable, and the war effort is sucking up resources at an unsustainable rate. The Kremlin insists that everything is under control, but behind the scenes, the pressure is building. Western sanctions have gone beyond just restricting Russia's access to foreign markets. They've hit the backbone of its economy. Key sectors like finance, technology, and most critically, oil and gas exports have been targeted. And while Russia has managed to sidestep some of the impact by shifting trade to China, India, and other non-Western partners, it's far from a perfect solution. Take oil, for example. Before the invasion, Russia was selling massive amounts of crude to Europe at market prices. Now, the European Union has largely cut Russian oil out of its supply chain, forcing Moscow to offload its exports to China and India at deep discounts. According to the International Energy Agency, Russian oil was selling at a 30% discount in 2023 compared to global prices, an arrangement that keeps the money flowing, but at a steep cost. It's the economic equivalent of putting a bandage on a bullet wound. And even these alternative trade relationships come with limits. China, often seen as Russia's closest major economic ally, has been careful not to offer too much direct support. Beijing values its relationship with Moscow, but not enough to risk Western sanctions. Chinese banks have largely avoided transactions that could violate sanctions. And while China has increased its purchase of Russian energy, it's done so on terms that overwhelmingly favor Beijing. In other words, Russia isn't an equal partner in this arrangement. It's a desperate seller with few options. Meanwhile, Russia's war spending has spiraled out of control. Military expenditures have jumped by over 40% year over year, according to Russia's Ministry of Finance. That kind of spending isn't just unsustainable, it's actively damaging the rest of the economy. Money that should be going toward healthcare, infrastructure, and education is being funneled directly into the war machine. Schools are being underfunded, hospitals are struggling, and entire regions are seeing critical public services deteriorate. And then there's the issue of workforce depletion. Hundreds of thousands of young, working-age Russians have fled the country, either to avoid conscription or to escape economic uncertainty. This brain drain is leaving massive gaps in Russia's tech, engineering, and finance industries, sectors that are crucial for long-term economic stability. And the ones who stay? Many of them are either being drafted or working in wartime production, which does nothing to strengthen the broader economy. The reality is that Russia is trapped in a vicious cycle. To keep the war going, it has to spend more money. But the more money it spends, the worse the economy gets. The worse the economy gets, the more desperate the government becomes to maintain control. And eventually, something has to give. So, what if Russia actually loses? The consequences would be far-reaching, not just for Russia, but for the entire global order. Let's break down the potential fallout from a Russian defeat. Putin's regime could collapse. Putin's rule has long been built on the perception of strength, stability, and Russia's resurgence as a global power. A military defeat would utterly shatter this carefully crafted image. Public support for the war has already been waning, with a 2023 poll by the Levada Center revealing that approval ratings for Putin and the war effort had significantly declined. If the war ends in failure, Putin's political survival would be in serious jeopardy. A weakened Putin could face widespread protests, elite infighting, and possible challenges from within his own government. This could lead to calls for his resignation, and there's no guarantee that his successor would be able to hold the country together. The transition of power could further destabilize Russia, especially if it's unclear whether a moderate government or a more extreme hardline faction takes charge. Russia could begin to fragment. Russia is a federation of over 80 regions, and many of these regions have long harbored grievances with the central government. A collapse of the Russian state could spark separatist movements, particularly in volatile regions like Chechnya, Siberia, and the North Caucasus. These areas, which already have historical tensions with Moscow, could push for greater autonomy or outright independence if Russia's central government weakens further. This could set off a chain reaction that leads to the disintegration of the Russian state itself. The global power shift. A Russian defeat would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the global system. For decades, Russia has positioned itself as a counterbalance to Western power. If Russia falls, the global order would shift dramatically. In the absence of a strong Russian presence, China could emerge as the undisputed leader of the anti-Western bloc. NATO, empowered by Russia's failure, would likely expand further into Eastern Europe and the Balkans, making it more difficult for Russia to reassert itself as a regional power. The consequences would be felt around the world, from military alliances to trade relationships, as countries reassess their positions in a newly reconfigured global landscape. It's a balancing act. The West is backing Ukraine, but they're also careful not to push Russia over the edge. Here's why. On the surface, a Russian defeat would appear to be a clear win for the West. After all, the collapse of Russia would mean the removal of one of the world's most dangerous authoritarian regimes. But the reality is far more complicated. A sudden collapse of Russia would create a massive geopolitical vacuum, one that could lead to instability in an already volatile region. With Russia's massive nuclear arsenal, there's also the very real risk of weapons falling into the wrong hands, or being used in a last-ditch effort to preserve the country's crumbling regime. The potential for conflict and instability could spread beyond Russia's borders, destabilizing the entire region. Western leaders are keenly aware of this risk, which is why their strategy has been to support Ukraine just enough to weaken Russia, but not enough to push it into total collapse. This delicate balance is designed to avoid triggering a chain reaction of instability that could create a far worse situation than the one currently unfolding in Ukraine. The question isn't just whether Russia can win, it's whether they can survive the consequences of either outcome. At this stage, Russia finds itself in a no-win scenario. If it continues fighting, it risks economic ruin, military exhaustion, and political instability. But if it loses the war, the consequences could be even more devastating. Putin's downfall, the fragmentation of the Russian state, and a massive shift in global power dynamics. This war is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of Russia itself. The outcome of this conflict will determine whether Russia remains a major player on the world stage or collapses into chaos. So the question remains, can Russia sustain this war, or are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Putin's empire? Only time will tell. If you found this breakdown insightful, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history geopolitics, and global strategy. What do you think? Is Russia doomed to collapse, or can Putin hold on? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.